This is the year that Matt Rule and the Nebraska Cornhuskers go bowling. Finally. Nebraska hasn't gone bowling since the 2016 season. And for being a blue blood program, the fact that I had to say that the Cornhuskers will reach a bowl game, clinch a bowl game appearance, as if that's some type of special achievement, and I had to put energy behind that statement, is honestly sad. It shows how far Nebraska has fallen. In 2017, they went 4-8. In 2018, they went 4-8. They went 5-7 in 2019, 3-5 in 2020. In 2021, they went 3-9. Scott Frost was fired early in 2022 after a 1-2 start, which included losses to a 1-11 Northwestern and a 6-7 Georgia Southern. They finished the year 4-8. And last year, they were 5-3 entering November. And they finished, you guessed it, 5-7. It's Nebraska. I have had an interesting relationship with Nebraska on this channel. A huge part of my subscriber base has been Nebraska fans since I would say approximately 2022, when I believed that Scott Frost would get things right, and I was, of course, wrong. I should have looked at the evidence. I should have better studied the fact that when you're this deep into a program like Nebraska and you can recruit at the level they recruited at and honestly got as many players drafted as they did under the Frost system, or players left Nebraska like Wan'Dale Robinson for Kentucky and they got drafted to the NFL and performed well at their schools that they transferred to before being drafted, I should have known better, but I didn't. But even before then, whenever I posted a Nebraska video, I would get views on it. I just would. Nebraska is very active on YouTube, but not just YouTube. They're active everywhere. They show up for their volleyball games. They fill their stadium, despite the fact that their team sucks. At least it used to. We'll talk about today why I think they no longer are going to be in the suckitude tier. I think they're going to more than graduate that this year. But in 2023, they were frustrating to watch. The Minnesota game was a classic Scott Frost loss. The Colorado game was an abject embarrassment. The only game that I can think of that resembled that type of performance under Frost or in years prior could be, I guess, whether it's a blowout loss to Illinois in the COVID year in 2020, the loss to Oklahoma, who finished 6-7, a blowout loss in 2022, or the loss to Minnesota in 2019 on the road, where Tanner Morgan and Tyler Johnson and PJ Fleck just completely annihilated and out-physicaled and bullied Nebraska that year. It wasn't exactly in the same style as all those games, but the result of losing by multiple possessions was similar. And the fact that they did it to a team that had similar or inferior talent, but was just better developed or made less mistakes, etc., etc. They were just better in some facet that caused them to dominate Nebraska. We saw once again against Michigan how far Nebraska was from being a blue blood, whether that was Ohio State back in 2019 or Michigan last season, a blowout loss in Memorial Stadium. And the 0-4 stretch in November is really what was the icing on the cake. Really. I mean, losing to Michigan State, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Iowa by a combined 16 points was, yeah, we don't need to talk about that anymore. Nebraska was 132nd in college football in turnover margin per game. They could not take care of the football, and their offensive line was very inconsistent. Quarterback was a disaster. The only good part of the team was the defense, the fact they looked more physical and better conditioned than ever, and also that at least at some point during the season, there was reasons for optimism, not just the desire for optimism. In 2021, for example, Nebraska, I think, only had a winning record when they played against Oklahoma, like when they faced their first opponent who was in the power level that finished with a winning record, because Illinois finished with a losing record in 2021. They played Oklahoma, played them tight, went 2-2, and then after that they never had a winning record again. It was the same thing, although with a much worse team, in 2022. In 2020, Nebraska, I don't believe ever had a winning record either. In 2019, they did, but very briefly, and everything fell apart, and the team from the beginning did not look as good as advertised. And in 2018, Nebraska couldn't catch a break until November. Last season, the 5-3 start, I think was huge. The fact that they could rebound from Minnesota and a blowout to Colorado, and Michigan really just splattering them all across the walls in their own home stadium, speaks to the resiliency of the team. Nebraska last year never quit. You didn't get the sense that they just laid down and died. Or even in many of the games outside of, I would say, the Minnesota game and the Iowa game, and maybe the Wisconsin game a bit, that they choked. Against Colorado, they just couldn't get out of their own way. They kept shooting themselves in the foot. Against Michigan, they had no chance. And in all of the November games, they were just outdone. They couldn't get ahead of their opponents by any significant margin, and they never truly controlled any of those games. They got out to a quick start against Wisconsin, and Wisconsin slowly crawled back and beat them. But against Iowa, they were never consistently in the lead. It was the same thing with Michigan State. And really what I think 2023 was a rebuilding year. That's what it was, where you tear things down, you try and patch up what you can, but overall you're focused on the future. And the 23 roster and its faults really were the epitome of how Scott Frost built the team. Also a little bit of, Matt Rule and Marcus Satterfield choosing Jeff Sims over, I don't know, better quarterbacks in the portal. But mistakes happen. Even the best staffs in all of college football make mistakes. They do. Nebraska certainly being one of those, and I don't even know if I would say they have one of college football's best staffs right now. You have to earn that honor. You do. But Nebraska last year made many steps forward. They did. They fell short of going bowling, though. And it's hard to talk about Nebraska and expectations because they're a blue blood program. But then you see on the screen here 3-9, 4-8, 5-7. I guess just looking at things from a mathematical and graphical standpoint, they should expect 6-6 if they're going to win an additional game per year. And maybe in a few years that automatically means they'll go 12-0. But that is just, I don't know, football analysis, and that's absolutely useless, especially with the transfer portal era and with how quickly coaching staffs are changing, trends and things like that. They mean a lot in some cases, but in the case of Nebraska, you don't want recent trends to matter all that much. And in the case with Nebraska or Michigan State or Rutgers or Illinois or even USC, for example, teams that aren't always at the top or have had changes over the past several seasons, whether in head coaching or drastic staff changes, especially with the transfer portal and the fact that rosters can change overnight, trends are just trends to a certain degree, at least when it comes to just wins and losses. Of course, when you go deeper than that, there are some things to pay attention to, and we'll get into that because there are some encouraging trends with Nebraska, even in the short amount of time Rule has been in Lincoln. But I think the expectation for Nebraska, it's hard to pinpoint because I'm tempted to say just 6-6, 7-5 It's an improvement over last year. It would be going bowling. It would even be a breakthrough to a large degree. Just settle at that. But I don't think so. I think the expectation, reasonably, for this team is a winning season, going 7-5 in the regular season, or you get that extra win, that 8th win, 8-4. That right there is the sweet spot. That's the expectation. Meet that, and I think that the team and the fan base and the average of those would be pleased with the outcome. Of course, coaches and players want to win as many games as possible, but I'm talking about in the sense that you're 2 or 3 wins better than last season, and with how much Nebraska brings back and the fact that their schedule is workable, it's a lot like last year's schedule. You have one game that looks like it's impossible to win on the schedule, but depending on how the cards are played and how the conditioning and training and coaching in the preseason goes, many things are possible. I just fell short of saying all things are possible because there's a game at Ohio State, which is the equivalent to hosting Michigan last year, where no, nothing is possible in that game, at least from what I can tell right now. It's a lot like Iowa, Nebraska's rival. They're playing on the road at Ohio State too. They can probably win all of their other games, or at least they have the potential of beating every other opponent on their schedule, except for that game at Ohio State, in which I find very little, if any, reason to believe the Hawkeyes, or in this case, the Huskers, can win that game. But with UTEP traveling to Lincoln in week 1, with Colorado, a rival, this time traveling to Lincoln instead of hosting the Huskers in Boulder in week 2. Northern Iowa comes to town in week 3. Illinois does as well in week 4 to kick off Big Ten Conference play. That's a night game on Friday. Purdue is the first road trip of the season in week 5. So Nebraska does get time to settle in at home, fix some things. Colorado, and I'm not even going to lie, even Illinois can give the Huskers challenges. Really any team on this schedule short of UTEP and Northern Iowa can give the Huskers problems given their recent history and performances. Last year's team could have performed better than 5-7, so it's not unrealistic to think that Matt Rule and Nebraska could honestly underperform a bit like they did last year or drop the ball at times. But it's a nice segue into the Rutgers game in week 6 or the road trip to Purdue in week 5, because a road game in the Big Ten has to be taken seriously. Then there's a nicely placed bye in week 7 that helps the Huskers prepare for back-to-back road games at Indiana and then the big one at Nebraska, at Ohio State in weeks 8 and 9. UCLA comes to town to play in Memorial Stadium in week 10. Nebraska has a bye in week 11. They play at USC in week 12, host Wisconsin in week 13, and play at Iowa in week 14. I think 7-5 and 8-4 is very realistic with this schedule. I would even be tempted to say that if you say that anything worse than 8-4 is a disappointment, I can buy into that, because Nebraska, in my mind, from a power rankings angle, is better than UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois, Purdue, better than Rutgers, who's a team that I'm very high on, as I already discussed in my most recent Big Ten team preview before talking about the Huskers. They're power rated, in my mind, better than Indiana. Already, 7 teams Nebraska is playing, I view them as better than in a power rankings angle. And even when you adjust for home field advantage, I'd favor Nebraska over all of these teams in the environments they'll be playing in. At Ohio State, I would view the Buckeyes as much superior to the Huskers. I think anyone would who's done their research. But I'd also think Nebraska is superior to UCLA. That's 8 teams. I think Nebraska, almost controversially, will be superior to USC in a power rankings angle. Wisconsin and Iowa, that gets a little iffy. I think they're very close to those teams, but Iowa right now I would place slightly ahead of Nebraska from that angle. Wisconsin's even closer, but they do have slightly better talent. I do think Fickle is from a resume standpoint, absolutely a better head coach. And just from my own angle and feelings and analysis, I think he's a better head coach as well. One of the best in the business, by the way. And I think Wisconsin has a better staff. So I lean Wisconsin there. But if you want to make the argument to me that with it being a home game and with Nebraska potentially having the better quarterback, bringing back a better defense from last year than what Wisconsin had last year, I can see the argument that Nebraska will be favored in 10 games on their schedule. Or because I don't think they'll be favored at USC on the road by Vegas, they'd at least be power rated from my perspective over 10 games, over 10 teams that are on their 12-game schedule. So I hope that all made sense. I think it does. But 7-5, 8-4, just from a neutral angle, from an angle where Nebraska is just improving from last year, improving substantially, but not necessarily becoming a top 25 team like I think they will, or even top 20 because I have them 20th in my top 25 power rankings. I think 7-5 and 8-4 is very realistic. The most likely losses here are obviously Ohio State, and I would say the final 3-game stretch of USC, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Those are also tough games, and then throw in either Colorado or Rutgers there as the 5th most likely loss. Those are 5 potential losses that could happen, and if Nebraska wins an additional one of those games, they get 8-4. And I think given Nebraska's recent history, 7-5 or 8-4, that would be the bar. A 7-5 team that looks way better on the field and is competitive in their losses and, beats one of Rutgers or Colorado, USC, Wisconsin, or Iowa would be improvement. 8-4, I'd be closer to saying that 8-4 is like the sweet spot. 7-5 could be a disappointment depending on how things go. 14 starters are back for Nebraska. 71% of their production is back. And I am willing to bet that quarterback, who the starter at quarterback will be freshman Dylan Raiola, will be a strength of this team. He was very good at taking care of the football and not throwing interceptions in high school. He has a cannon of an arm. He's strong. He has awareness in the pocket. I think he'll be a top 25 quarterback this year. At running back, Emmett Johnson, Gabe Ervin Jr., Ramir Johnson, and Dante Dowdle, they highlight one of the deeper running back rooms in the Big Ten. They could run a 4-man rotation and be successful if the offensive line is just average or above average. And Nebraska, particularly on the interior, I think looks to profile at that level this year. I do view the offensive line overall as a weak link, but I don't view any part of Nebraska's team as bad per se. I think special teams could also be a weak link that I didn't necessarily put up on the screen. And linebacker, Javin Wright is a player that I very much like. I listed linebacker as an area of concern before he was even injured. He's out right now with an undisclosed health condition. He's previously had surgery to help with blood clots, so maybe it's something with that. But Luke Reimer and Nick Henrich left after last season, and with Wright being out for an unknown amount of time, someone has to step up in that room. And that, I think, is an area of concern, along with offensive tackle, where, sadly, Teddy Prohaska went down with an injury, a season-ending injury, tore his ACL. So those areas are the weak links of the team, but let's get back to the strengths. I like Nash Hutmacher on the defensive line. I absolutely love him, and also Ty Robinson, the 2 interior players. And at defensive back, there's Deshaun Singleton, there's Bly Hill, there's Isaac Gifford, Tommy Hill, who I saw someone projected him to be a first-round pick in the 2025 NFL draft. And that's somewhat surprising, but also not, because I do think that Tommy Hill is a player with all-American potential this year. He's going to be a very good quarterback. I think he had 4 passes defended, 4 interceptions, was very good in coverage, and he's an athlete, period, amen. His ceiling is limitless. And having him with a great supporting cast in the secondary and all of them working together in that unit, they could have one of the better secondaries in all of college football. And in the Big Ten, a conference that has Michigan with Will Johnson, Ohio State with Denzel Burke and Caleb Downs and Jordan Hancock, Iowa with Sebastian Castro, Quinn Schulte, Xavier Nwapka, and don't even forget about Wisconsin with Ricardo Holman and Hunter Wohler. And there are other secondary units in the Big Ten that are really, really good. When I look at Nebraska, the question is all about Dylan Raiola and if he lives up to his potential and what I think he can do or not. Because Nebraska was 108th in quarterback efficiency last season, and they definitely need to improve on that. I think the Huskers beat UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois, Purdue, Rutgers, Indiana, UCLA, and USC. I think they dropped the game at Ohio State and also finished the year with a 2-game losing streak against Wisconsin, who I think matches up very well with the Huskers, and Iowa on the road. It's a road game, a rivalry game. I think Iowa is better than Nebraska in every facet of the game when it comes to defense. And I think Iowa may have the better offensive line. That combined with home field advantage, I think results in an Iowa Hawkeye win. But I think the Cornhuskers, with taking their first bowl appearance since the Obama presidency very seriously, I think they'll beat Oklahoma in the Music City Bowl, capping off a 10-3 record, 6-3 record in Big Ten Conference play. Their ceiling, I think, is 10-2. I think they're guaranteed to lose an additional game outside of at Ohio State. The roster, while good, I don't think has as many X-factor players as some teams that are at the same level or perhaps worse. I'll give you an example, like USC. USC's entire skill position could be X-factor players, like all of their receivers, their quarterback. They brought in several good defensive back players from the portal, and they do have enough defensive linemen like Nate Clifton, incoming transfer from Vanderbilt, and Bear Alexander, to where if everything went right for USC, they could have X-factor players all across the board, and even with a tough schedule, they could, go 10-2, maybe 11-1, though I'd say 10-2 is probably best case scenario for the Trojans. Get into the playoff with their tough schedule at a lower seed and make a run. For Nebraska, they have a lot of good players, great players, but I think Rule needs more time, as in another year of strength and conditioning and doing things his way and bringing in another good recruiting class to see more X-factor players blossom, which means whether it's, again, Colorado, Rutgers, Ohio State, USC, Wisconsin, Iowa, heck, maybe at Indiana as a trap game spot, or at Purdue in the first road game of the season. In one of those games, I think Nebraska will be, whether it's upset or there are just 2 good teams on the schedule that are too good for Nebraska, I think their ceiling is 10-2. Their floor is 6-6 in my mind. Before we resume, I want to remind you all to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on my video down in the comment section below. I should be doing this at the beginning of these videos, and I just forget to do so because I'm so excited to talk about these teams. But I wanted to get that reminder out there because it's better late than never to remind you all to join the best college football channel on YouTube. We're aspiring to be that this year. I believe we can, and I believe in multiple aspects we are. You're going to get analysis, you're going to get the truth, you're going to get my opinion, and when I'm wrong, you're going to get my correction of my previous opinion and my admission that I was wrong. You're going to get the full package here on College Football with Sam. And the simplest way to support the channel is to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and also share this video around, because the more subs and likes we get, the closer we get to my 2 giveaways that I'll be doing. One for 20,000 subscribers and another for the first video that reaches 1,000 likes. But let's dive back into Nebraska football. I want to talk about the reasons why I'm right on this team, because I think there are many. Number one is the fact that Nebraska was 132nd in turnovers per game, and also turnover margin per game, which is, it's just not good. It absolutely is not. They were an outlier in that category. When you are that extreme, you are an outlier. It's like with Penn State last year, although I wonder if Penn State's going to take that much of a step back in terms of gaining turnovers, because Drew Aller, whether it was because of his inaccuracy or the fact that he threw a lot of safe passes, he consistently didn't turn over the football, and Penn State has consistently forced turnovers on defense for quite a while now. It's one of those trends where you look at the coaching, whether it's Brent Pry or Manny Diaz or their assistants, and you look at how the roster's been built and who comes back. I think Penn State's defense should be still very efficient at forcing turnovers, getting to the quarterback, being one of the best defenses in all of college football. But that's actually the same case for Nebraska, too. The Huskers bring back most of their defense that was top 20 last year. It was a top 20 defense for sure. Some would argue it was better or worse than that, but it was a much improved defense compared to the average Eric Chinander defense. That combined with an offense that likely will produce less turnovers, just given what Dylan Raiola did in high school and the fact that they were such an extreme outlier, it's crazy. Plus, Jeff Sims is Arizona State's backup quarterback, and Heinrich Haarberg is probably going to be used as a Swiss Army knife on offense. So the 2 biggest contributors to the turnover problem are either 1, not on the team, or 2, in a different role that will limit their proclivity to mess up the success of the team. In fact, I would be willing to bet that Haarberg this year will contribute to the team's success, perhaps in a major way, as he's much superior at scrambling the football, and I would say more willing and should be more willing to take a hit than Dylan Raiola. It's nice that Nebraska has quarterback depth and depth at multiple positions, particularly on defense, but even on offense too. And what's helped that is Matt Rule has been aggressive when he needs to be in the portal, but he also brought in a top 25 recruiting class in 2024 with several key contributors, mainly like Dylan Raiola, but maybe Carter Nelson can get some action. Maybe some of the offensive linemen can get action. On defense, there may be fewer opportunities because of how good the unit was and how much they brought back. But I wouldn't be shocked if there are some younger players who really step up this season as Rule continues to bring in his guys. Because the Scott Frost players, the few that are left in some areas, they've either taken off, but the ones who haven't taken off under this new staff are going to get, for better or for worse, probably left behind, because Frost did not do a good job of assessing talent and putting talent in a position to win. So those are the reasons why I think Nebraska will succeed this year. The even better news, like if Nebraska exceeds my 9-3 prediction, is the defense does have a top 5 ceiling. This defense could, if Hutmacher, Robinson, Bullock at linebacker, Stephon Thompson at linebacker, the secondary, if they all step up at once and are consistently good, and injuries for the remainder of the year are at a minimum, they still happen because it's a part of the game, but not anything drastic, this defense could be one of the best in America, and not just one of the best as it relates to a team that's in the top 25 to 10 range. The bad is Raiola's a freshman. He could be worse than what I and many others think. And the offensive line's also banged up. And a banged up offensive line, especially one that still has a lot of work to do, like Nebraska's, could easily get overwhelmed in the Big Ten where, let's face it, Purdue is physical up front on both the O-line and D-line. They're big, they're fast, they're athletic, they're strong. Colorado has brought in defensive ends who I think are going to be very productive this year. And Rutgers, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio State are all going to have anywhere from great to elite defenses. And Indiana, too. Kurt Cignetti's bringing in many James Madison transfers on offense and defense to this Indiana team. James Madison's defense was really good last year, and if there was any substance to it outside of just dominating Group of 5 competition, they could be a challenge for an offensive line like Nebraska's. So it's imperative that the O-line plays to its ceiling, that someone steps up there, that the defense steps up. But I think that with the top 25 recruiting class, with the fact that Nebraska will improve at turning over the football, I think that they're going to improve. And a big part of the reason why, in addition, if we want to zoom in with the microscope, is their X factor, and that's their defensive tackles, Ty Robinson and Nash Hutmacher. Nebraska's defense last year was 12th in opponent offensive points per game allowed. They were 10th in opponent points per play, only allowing 0.267 points per play. They were 7th, top 10, in both rushing yards allowed per game, only allowing 92.9. They were 6th in opponent yards per carry, only allowing 3. Is also top 10. And they were 38th in sack percentage. They got to opposing quarterbacks 7.62% of the time that they dropped back, and that's a very impressive number. Nash Hutmacher barely missed out on my All-American team. If there was a 5th team, for example, I have 4 teams for the 4 Power 4 conferences, and I even include backups to the main players just to make sure I can get all of the nation's elite and near elite players, along with, including Group of 5 players who deserve to be up there and players from all the conferences. Hutmacher barely, and I mean barely, missed out on this list. He's up there. He could be an All-American this year. He has that talent ceiling. And Tommy Hill, he's on my All-American team. He's also on my second team All Big Ten. And then others on the All Big Ten team list besides Hutmacher and Hill are Dylan Raiola, Bryce Benhart, Thomas Fedoni II, Bly Hill, Emmett Johnson, Micah Mezcua, Jamal Banks, Javin Wright, and Isaac Gifford. Notice how Nebraska doesn't, as I said earlier, they don't have any first-team All Big Ten players. Tommy Hill could be. Nash Hutmacher could be. Dylan Raiola, probably not, just because Miller Moss and Dylan Gabriel exist. But as I said earlier, Nebraska has a lot of good, great players, even some near elite, and I'd say elite players with Hill and Hutmacher, but it's not to the same degree that Iowa, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, and I would say even like Wisconsin and Rutgers have. But I think that's because in comparison to all those teams, none of those teams, if they have newer recent coaching staffs, or obviously if their coaching staffs have been there for a long time, like Ryan Day or Kirk Ferentz, Nebraska's having to undergo a complete restructuring of their program. None of those other teams that I've mentioned have had to do that. They've already overcame that massive barrier in some way or another. They've already started the rebuilding process, or finished it, rather, outside of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin was in a better place when Paul Chryst was fired than Nebraska when Scott Frost was fired by a mile, even though there were some issues there. Raiola's a player who will make or break the season. I think that's obvious. I think that's also obvious in regards to the offensive line. But look on defense. And I would say that the Cornhuskers, 32 sacks is great, but if they can get more, closer to 40, that would be even more helpful. It's not just because they face some high-octane offenses. It's also because whether it was Michigan last season or other teams throughout the year, Nebraska was able to be worn down up front at times. And that might be me nitpicking, but the offense is not going to be a top 10 unit. So in order to maximize the potential for wins, the defense playing at a top 10 level, maybe even to a top 5 level, would be optimal. Jamari Butler had 5.5 sacks. Hutmacher had 4.5. Cameron Lenhart, a young player, had 3. Luke Reimer had 5, and he's gone. Nick Henrich had 2. he is gone. And Javin Wright had a half sack. He's out right now, briefly. Ty Robinson only had a sack despite 29 total tackles. So the more players can get pressure, the better. And as for the secondary, allowing less big pass plays, being a little tighter in coverage, more disciplined in coverage, would also be a game breaker, and in a good way. Thank you all so much for watching my analysis and record prediction for Nebraska football. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Nebraska Rascal for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Conradula OH, and Ismar for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members. And if you want to support the channel, sign up as a Patreon member through the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. If you are a Heisman member, after 6 months of membership, you do get signed College Football with Sam merchandise. If you want merchandise without having to sign up as a Heisman member and paying for 6 months, you can just visit my merchandise store and purchase what you want from there. It's very comfortable, high quality, and it'll be shipped directly to you in a very efficient order of time. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all around. Bye-bye.